Arnold Richard Wolfe. My serial number was 6979385, which is the shortest serial number you can find. All the others will start with 1 or a 0. But that was the regular Army before the war. I joined the Army in 1939. And the period was more depression than anything. And I can remember going to school in the 4th grade, and my sister giving me a nickel and saying, "This is for your car fare and your lunch." Even in those days, you couldn't do much on a nickel. But nevertheless, that's the way it was. Money was scarce. And people worked, if you got a job, I can remember taking jobs as a kid for $4.50 a day. And you would take groceries up 5 flights of stairs and deliver them. Your salary, $4.50 a week. No, it was a week, not a day. It was a week. And you worked all week. But those were tough times, which we're getting into right now. From that, I hitchhiked across the country when I think I was about 15. We didn't have any problem hitchhiking. People picked you up without any problem at all. And I got a ride in Chicago, going out of Chicago, on Route 66, heading towards Los Angeles, with a man who told me he was in his 90s. He had a Cadillac, and he was driving about 85 miles an hour. That was more scary than the war. But when we got to Los Angeles, we went up in the San Pedro area, and we worked around the dining rooms for officers handling the 14-inch guns sitting overlooking Los Angeles in the harbor. And there we learned a little bit about Army life and what goes on. And I guess when we came back, I never even thought of it. Another fellow asked me if I'd go down with him and join the Army. He wanted to join the Army. I said, "Yeah, I'll go with you." So we went down together. I got taken in. He was refused. So I was in the Army and was stationed then at Fort Totten, Long Island. From there we did World's Fair work around the New York World's Fair, guarding the railroad for President Roosevelt to come in, the King and Queen of England to come in. And we didn't actually guard for them. We were on the outskirts of the place. Another outfit took over that one. We were taken in then and sent to Central Park when the war broke out, so that we set up an anti-aircraft searchlight and machine gun. Some of the fellows had anti-aircraft equipment on the rooftop, and their families lived in the building they were on the top of the roof of. These were all guys in the 62nd, belonging, attached to the 1st Infantry Division. From that, we were taken over and put on the Queen Elizabeth, sent to Scotland. Scotland, we went to Plymouth. And I was in Plymouth. We were sent up to load up on ships that were getting ready for an invasion. The invasion was Oran, Algeria. That's when they invaded Africa. But our assignment was Iran, and it was the French holding it. So they had to fight the French, who didn't fight actually that much, but they did shoot at one another. And the British came in and sunk 2 battleships belonging to the French in that harbor. People don't realize how much interwar there was between France, Germany, and all the others. But from there, when we went on board the ship, we were called out, 3 of us, and we were told, go back down to shore. Stay there. There'll be an officer come and pick you up. This colonel came over, picked us up, told us to get on the train, said, you're going to a repo depot. Well, we knew what a repo depot was. It was replacement depot. So when we got there, we were told, you're part of the MP battalion. You are going to be permanent stationed here because we're expecting 100,000 troops to come through this place. And you fellows all have experience. You're here. Well, I stayed there for a while, and we were shipped around different places. I went with got ready for D-Day. I was with the rear echelon of the 4th Infantry Division. I caught up with them in Marie-Saint-Anglaire, which we went across France, heading towards the hedgerows of Normandy. We went up the Normandy coast through the hedgerows, and I was working as Forward Observer's radio operator. We went all the way to Cherbourg, and when they took Cherbourg, they pulled us out for a rest, sent us to Saint-Lô and Saint-Pierre. The rest was about 2 days. We were right in the middle of the breakthrough to take France. So we got stuck with the Hurtgen Forest, Saint-Lô, Saint-Pierre, and the Felice Gap, where they had all the Germans trapped. We went up through that, and they pulled us out, sent us towards Paris. So the 4th went to Paris, and we sat outside of Paris for 3 days, waiting for the French to catch up, so they could be the first to enter Paris. The 8th Infantry Regiment went in with the French. It was the only one that went in was the 8th Regiment. We went around Paris and headed towards Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Well, we got as far as the Siegfried Line when I got hit. And we got sent out, pulled out, and sent back to Paris to a hospital. While I was laying in the hospital, I remember an officer came in and threw a Purple Heart on my chest and a Bronze Star. I never heard from them again. That was the award of the medals. Then we got, from there, sent to England. Because you were wounded, you'd be more than 30 days getting better. So while I was in England, I put in to get married to this girl. They sent a priest and a minister to talk with me. And they sat for an entire afternoon telling me that mixed marriages don't work and that you really don't want to get married, that the commanding officer said you shouldn't do this. And I said, no, I'm going to put the papers in anyway. And finally, after about 4 hours, they said, well, you put those papers in, you're going to be back in Paris tomorrow morning. I said, I'm putting the papers in. That evening, I was sitting on my bunk. 2 men walked in and picked me up by the shoulders. I'm not a little boy. I was on an airplane and in Paris the next morning. And I joined the MP squad there in a battalion at Barbès-Rochechouart, which is the Pigalle of Paris, where all the bars and everything are. And that was our patrol. And we were assigned to work with the French police so that they would have somebody that could handle the American soldiers. So we rode with them and went through Paris. And my wife never let me forget what we were doing. We were going through all the houses of prostitution, examining them. And it was very interesting. I had to go back to England. It took me until 45 to finally get married in a Methodist church in England. And now I tried to get discharged over there, but they wouldn't discharge you. So I had to come home. Well, I had enough points that I could have flown home. But in trying to get discharged, they sent me to Marseille, France. And we did inventory of equipment to be sent back to the States. And trucks would pull up at the depot and just take it away. But it wasn't listed to go, but it was taken. From there, I wound up going back to England. And we got married. It took a little doing. Then I came home, and she followed in 46. To give you a little story on that, my granddaughter married a man from the town that my wife came from and moved to that town to live. She's now a lawyer in that town and a lawyer in New York City. In about 98, I think it was, we were invited to come to England. And we went to England because we had a lot of relatives there. She did. And we went to London. We were going to go to visit Buckingham Palace. Well, we were told to stay on the square in front of the palace. And the one fellow that was with me was told to put a red scarf around his neck, which he did. And we were standing there looking at one another trying to figure this out. Well, a fellow came over and said, Mr. Wolfe, Mr. Powell, Mrs. Wolfe, Mrs. Powell. And we said, yeah. He said, follow me. So we started across the street with him, and the cops on horseback started closing in on us until he raised his hand up and they backed off. We got over to the gate, the main gates of the castle, and the policeman sitting there read our names off again. And we looked at one another and we answered, yeah, that was us. And the gates opened. And the guy says, follow me. And we followed him, and the guards came to attention and saluted. Well, all the people on the outside are watching. There's thousands of people. Took us over and put us on the ambassador's entrance to the castle and said, stay here. Don't take pictures. If you snap pictures, it goes in the eyes of the guards and they get very upset, so do not take pictures. Well, we didn't take any. But while we were there and after the ceremony, he came back out and he says, follow me. And we followed him again. He goes into the castle, gave us a grand tour of the castle, private tour, then took us through the stables and showed us the horses and the carriages. And that's where we found out who he was. He's the guy that handles all of the horses for the Queen and all of the carriages that they use and handles the hired help for the castle. He was my nephew's next door neighbor, but we didn't know that. And he set this up. So it was very interesting. It was something you don't get very often. I haven't got the foggiest idea any more than you do. All we knew is that we were laying in bed and a colonel came through and threw them on our chest. That was the awards. And I still don't know. And I've tried to find out. I still haven't found out. She came from Walsall, W-A-L-S-A-L-L, England, just outside of Birmingham, which is the Midlands. It's the second largest city of England, Birmingham. Walsall is a town of 200,000, and it's noted for leather and coal. My job was to go with a lieutenant for forward observation work and radio back artillery, German positions. We had to go up through the hedgerows, cross the openings that they had for cattle that the Germans had zeroed in with machine guns, and try to get further up as close as you could in front of the infantry, which didn't want you around them. And you could really understand why, because the Germans kept firing mortars at you. But they were very careful not to upset you too much, because we fired white phosphorus at them. And this is the stuff that they say now that, oh, we don't use that. I remember we used to use it. That's that type of thing we did. We got up to the, through all the hedgerows, and there was, you'd go up a road and there'd be wire that much in a pile, just wires running. That's useless. Nobody knew where they went. They were German wires and American wires and British wires. Nobody knew what they were. So you had to lay new wires if you wanted a telephone. And if you were going to use the radio, you had to carry it on your back. So we did pretty good with it. We got lucky. We didn't get picked off any. We got close calls, but we are getting, by the way, the French Legion of Merit badge or medal sometime next month. The French are a little slow. But I did get a certificate from Cherbourg, the head of the Cherbourg Peninsula, which says thank you for the relieving them of the Germans. And there's a little medal with it. But the other one is France's highest award for non-citizens. And we're supposed to get that one. From Cherbourg, we were pulled sideways to St. Lo and St. Pierre, where they wanted to break the German lines so that Patton could take his tank straight across. We were assigned to be up in the front when the bombers went across, and they had 3,000 bombers come over and bomb those positions. There was a white road that ran parallel with the lines. But when they were bombing them, they were bombing in front. And the soot and stuff kept coming back, which covered the road and made it look from the air like the road was where the Americans were. So they actually did bomb some of the Americans. And when we crossed the road in a Jeep, 3 of us. And we went up a hill. There was an 88 sitting in the middle of the road, loaded, aimed right down the road. The only thing you could find of Germans were their clothing on the treetops. They had made a direct hit with a 500-pound bomb. 3,000 planes. There was nothing that... The Germans that I saw coming out, their eyes were like that. I mean, they were stunned. They couldn't fight. There was nothing. We sat up on the top of a hill and just watched. And why the lieutenant crossed when he did, I don't know, but it was stupid. But I guess it was lucky, because we made it. But we did a lot of things that were you weren't supposed to do. I know for food, we had a kettle in the front of the Jeep, about 2 feet tall, and you had a wire cutter on the front of the Jeep. But we had the kettle attached to that, and we had a blowtorch. And every time we passed a farm, we got whatever food we could get and would make a stew and cook it with the blowtorch. But we didn't go hungry. I mean, a lot of people did. But being forward observers, you have a lot more freedom. We did pretty good. There wasn't much there because everything moved fast there. We crossed into Luxembourg, and there was some fighting, but not much. And we came across a lot of tanks on the side of us, and we stayed over on it'd be the Bayside, trying to go into the Siegfried line. Well, we didn't quite make it. Somebody in the Siegfried line had a Tiger tank sitting up in there, and he put a shell right between the 3 of us. So they took the 3 of us out, and we made our own way back to a first aid station. The lieutenant, I think, lost 1 leg. I don't know what happened to him after that. And the sergeant had a hole in his shoulder, and I got 3 hits in my leg. But other than that...
Shrapnel.
It was all shrapnel. We were lucky it wasn't an airburst. We were on the flank. The 4th stayed on the flank of the bulge and didn't actually get involved. They had enough to do. They had the Hurtgen Forest. That was enough. The .50 caliber was a good weapon. We had them lined up on going up through the hedgerows. Took 50 calibers in quads of 4 and put them on tripods on a trailer, and then brought 4 trailers up before the hedgerow and cut the hedgerow in half. Those things would go right through the hedgerow and just tear it apart. So they broke up a lot of hedgerows that way, but they had to find out where to go. I don't think they used it for smoke.
Well,
I think they used it for airburst. Because if you fire over somebody's head with white phosphorus and it spreads, when it comes to the ground, it's burning. It's hot. Anything on the ground is, God help it. When you went through the hedgerows and you had openings where the Germans had machine guns to guard the openings. If you made it to the other side, the Germans had it zeroed in on the other side so they could drop mortars all along the road. So if you made it, you were lucky. And we were just plain lucky. The Hurtgen was, for me, it was all right because it was up in front of me. We didn't have to go up where the soldiers were trapped and getting trees down on top of them. And we had the luxury of having a Jeep and being able to go where we wanted. So we could actually, in a couple of times, we just went off on the side and just sat and didn't do anything, which not cowardly. I mean, it's just you get the hell out of there. You know, there's all sorts of stories like black soldiers were not allowed to fight. People don't realize that. But yet there were black soldiers fighting. In Italy, there was black artillery that did very well, black infantry outfit, and Air Force that did great work. But they were never allowed in the fighting units until Truman became president. And when Truman became president, he opened it up. And a lot of people tell you, well, I saw blacks in military units in Germany. Well, they're right. But it wasn't until he came into office. And yet in England, they had black soldiers on one side of town and southern white soldiers on the other side of town. And they used to tell them that, well, you can go to town today, they can go to town tomorrow. You want to have a riot on your hands. They had several. But they did that. I mean, it was stupid. But they did a lot of that. And the black soldiers were actually good. If you remember the Red Ball Express, they ran that. And they did a wonderful job with it. People don't understand when they talk against something, they'll say that, well, the blacks didn't do any fighting, but they did. And is it their fault that they weren't allowed in the units, which they weren't? Well, when we got hit, we worked our way back to an aid station, which was a couple miles. And we got the lieutenant in the Jeep, and his leg was just hanging on. We got to the aid station, and they patched us up and sent us by ambulance that night to Paris. No headlights. The drivers had to drive in the dark, and they were all black drivers. They were all black. They drove all the way into Paris. That was from Belgium, almost into the Siegfried line, coming that way. When we got to Paris, they put us in a hospital. Upstairs were German prisoners. And from there, they said if you were going to be more than 30 days, they'd send you to England. So they flew us from there, from the airfield in Paris to England. And I recuperated there. That's when I put in to get married and got sent back to Paris. Well, in Paris, we had a lot of German soldiers, a lot of American soldiers that deserted. Some soldiers had deserted with truckloads of material and sold it and actually owned bars. And if an MP walked in, God help them, they were 3 or 4 got shot. So we were given the choice of working with the French police and checking them. And what we did, would pull up alongside of somebody. If you were walking, the man in the back seat would aim an M1 at your head. The man in the front seat had a .45, and the driver would say, "May I see your pass, please?" And I don't think he wanted to make any wrong move. But they did that constantly. It's to break up. You had all sorts of problems. And you'd go to the railway station. You'd be stationed upstairs looking down at the platform, and you'd profile, trying to pick up American deserters and Germans. Now they say you can't profile, but they profile then. And we did. We picked up a few. But most of that was just routine. In Warsaw, she kept writing to the bishop to get permission for me to marry her. Finally, we got permission, and I got a pass, and we went over, we got married, and I had to go back to France again to be discharged to the States. So the reason I went back to France was I had put in to get discharged overseas. And I think as a revenge, they sent me to France. And then I went back home, and she came over in '46. And in 2000, I wrote an article asking the British Cunard Line to put a plaque on the new Queen Mary II in honor of the war brides that it brought home, the first one, and the 800,000 troops it took around the world. And the head of Cunard Line said he thought it was nice, and he would talk to the board and see if it was done. So the Sun News in Myrtle Beach wrote an article on it and thought it was a good idea. And I had people from the Air Force, people from the British Air Force, from Australia, from all over write letters saying they were in favor of this. Never got done. The idea was given to the old ship, which is in Los Angeles. And they're selling it for $25 each. You can put your name. Yeah, well, she had to get the Catholic Church and the bishop from the Methodist Church to say it was okay, because the Army said no. And, well, they were the ones that said mixed marriages don't work, and that was actually a colonel who was in charge of the unit who decided that people weren't going to get married. And you'd be surprised at the power those people had in those days. A colonel in the Army was powerful, as you well know. But we went through that, and then her family set the wedding up. We got married. We were married 53 years before she died. The ministers were very good. They did a very nice job and were very sympathetic and tried to help us with everything they could. And both being young, the church was actually very nice and really worked with us. And if it hadn't been for that, we wouldn't have gotten married, because they had to get permission and override the Army, really. And if they didn't do that, I would have been back in the States and she would have been over there, and then I would have had to wait until peacetime. which is pretty hard. But no, it worked out. It's hard to remember the marriage we took. We went to Wales for our honeymoon, and we went to a place called Pontypridd, where she lived as a child. And odd thing was, she actually, her aunt ran a home for the mentally ill. And when I came out of the Army, I took a job as a policeman. And then I took a job working in a hospital for the mentally ill in Orangeburg, New York. They had 9,000 patients. And I was asked if I would run a program for teenage children, 16 to 21. They were really nice kids, but the courts didn't know what to do with them, so they put them in mental institutions. And our job then was to break it off and make private group, and it worked very well. When I retired, my wife and I came down here. We were looking at Wedgefield, the golf course and houses. And we came very close to buying down in Wedgefield. Then we saw a place up in Briarcliff Acres that we also had an option on. But the hurricane came off the coast at that time and poured water into the place. And that house got drowned. And we decided, well, we didn't know what to do with it, so we let it go. We should have taken it. It was worth a fortune. But after that, we found a place in Carolina Shores, and we were going to build. And we bought a lot in Carolina Shores, and I hired a contractor, and we rented a place in Windjammer Village, right on the border of North and South Carolina. Well, renting there, she decided that, well, it'd be better if we just built here. It's nice, because you have swimming pools and everything else, and you're on the intercoastal waterway. So we built a house there. And I sold a lot in Carolina Shores and bought 2 more lots in Windjammer. So I had 4 lots in Windjammer Village. So we built a house there. And I've been there ever since. Well, a forward observer will look for enemy positions and plot it on a map, give it to the radio operator, who will call it back to headquarters, who will take a division of artillery, they can take 2 or 3 divisions in the American forces, something the enemy couldn't do, and take all of the guns in that area and focus them on the one point that you want. And you'd call in and you'd say you had a fire for them, fire 1 round for spotting, 2nd round to see what it was doing, or you'd say fire for effect, and they'd fire 20 rounds, if that's what you told them to do. And they'd focus the whole area, or they could pinpoint a square on the map. And your job would be to take that pinpoint and call it back to headquarters, so the guns would focus in on that one spot. That basically is what you would do. You have a life expectancy of a week for in that type of thing. But that's not a true statement. I mean, that's what people would say. But we went for a few months. Well, when you try to cross a spot where Germans have a machine gun aimed in and mortars that can drop in over you, they can pretty well box you in unless you're very lucky and find places to crawl into where the shrapnel won't hit you. And that's basically what we did. What he would try to do is have them fire one shot. And with that one shot, he'd estimate how close he was to his target. And if he needed to get another one, he'd have them fire again. Otherwise, he would look at the maps and try to take the square and have them pinpoint on that square. And from the first shot, if he could focus it in, he would, but if he couldn't, he might fire 20 shots, figuring on hitting that central target. The Germans used to fire an 88, one shell at a time, and they were so punctual, you could time them. You could cross a bridge and know exactly when they were going to fire. And many of the roads, you'd put MPs on them, and they'd time how many shots have been fired and when they'll fire the next one and have the traffic going in between. The Germans never changed. They were just too methodical. They were good soldiers, though. Anybody that said they weren't was out of their mind.